begin by thanking Lynn Vartan for this collaboration with the School of Business. I also want to make you aware that we will be having a discussion with Charles this evening at 5:45 in the School of Business, room 120. So if you like what you hear here, please join us at 5:45 again in the School of Business, room 120. He'll be having a conversation with Scott Wyatt and with Governor Cox about civility in debate. So that will be a fascinating discussion. Our speaker today studied modern history and politics at the University of Oxford. He is the author of the book, The Conservatarian Manifesto. He is a writer and editor at National Review. He co-hosts two very popular podcasts, Mad Dogs and Englishman. Has an has an audience of about 50,000, and the editors has an audience of a little under 200,000. He speaks frequently on TV. He has been on the BBC, Real Time with Bill Maher, Fox News, Fox Business, MSNBC, and others. A couple other observations about our speaker today. He is an Englishman who is fluent in French, yet he is an American citizen. He is well-versed in history, yet he's also extraordinarily tech-savvy. He is a Florida man who has written a manifesto, and yet there are no mugshots of him. He is a professional musician, a former professional musician, and always a rock star. In fact, some say he is the Lemmy Kilmister of American journalism. Please welcome Charles C.W. Cooke.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me here again. Because of coronavirus, I actually haven't left my state for 14 months until today. So this is a great place to come to. Any place is a great place to come to, but this is an especially great place to come to. There's no more beautiful place to break that streak. Florida is extremely flat and humid, so just to see some mountains was lovely. Last time I was here at SUU back in late 2019, I talked about entrepreneurship as a system of problem solving, but specifically about the abundance of weird products in the United States, products that would never have seen the light of day if we had looked to the government or even to many of our big corporations for their invention. And I suggested that as a culture, we routinely undervalue how unusual and valuable the things we have in America and in the modern world more generally are. From drive-through donut shops, to laser tag, to roller coasters, to the frisbee, to the golf cart, to the extraordinarily strange Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which we all just accepted as kids, but which, when you stop and think about it, is about as odd as it's possible to get, and really could only have come from the mind of a couple of free, creative, possibly drunk individuals. Today, though, I want to step a bit further back on the chain and talk not so much about the importance of weird products, but about the importance of weird people. Specifically, I want to speak in favor of weird people, and I want to argue that they're crucial for our culture and our economy and our politics and our science and more. Now, don't worry, I'm not just saying this because I live in Florida and because Florida is supposed to have the highest concentration of weirdos in the United States. And I'm not just saying it because I'm originally British and because we essentially invented the modern eccentric. In fact, one of my great fears in life is ending up in one of those Florida Man headlines that you see on the internet. You know, armed National Review writer holding frozen margarita drives golf cart into swamp, that kind of thing. I'm saying it instead because I'm increasingly alarmed that our society is marginalizing and discouraging weird people, and in the process ensuring that they will never get to make the contributions that they have historically made, either because those people are quickly shuffled out of the room when they do something unusual, or because watching what happens to people who step out of line nowadays, they never try in the first place. At the moment, it seems to me that America is in the midst of a cultural riot. Over the last few years, a small number of extremely powerful people seem to have appointed themselves as our national arbiters of taste. And they've begun scouring the past statements of anyone who makes waves, trying to find slip-ups or mistakes or eccentricities. And then if they can, they've tried to have those people removed from public life. I don't think that's an overstatement. In the last few months alone, Disney fired one of the stars of its show, The Mandalorian. One of the New York Times' best science writers, a man who'd worked there since 1976, was cancelled. Dr. Seuss's own publishing house decided to stop selling some of his books. In fact, just before I came up here, a British journalist called Piers Morgan, who I have spent my life disliking and have written against a lot, was fired, which is bad news. I don't like the guy, but it's bad news. He was fired because he said some things about the royal family that were deemed to be rude, making you wonder what century we're living in. And there are too many people out there now who seem to spend their time worrying about conversations that other people are having of which they don't approve or over which they don't have control. Now, many of these steps, much of this behavior is ostensibly taken in the name of diversity, but it actually yields the opposite outcome. It yields conformity. Increasingly, we are permanently disfavoring people who are genuinely different. Now, in and of itself, I consider this to be a problem. I consider it to be a problem because, and if you look at these flags, you will see why. I believe in free inquiry, in the right to offend, in the opportunity to seek truth. I also believe in redemption and growth. People change. I believe all people are capable of engaging in our system and in our republic, and that to argue that some people can't or need special protection is condescending. And I think it's important that some of our institutions that are supposed to be the most classically liberal, universities, newspapers, stay that way. And because I worry that if they don't, we're going to abandon the American order. But I don't want to talk about that. We could talk about cancel culture and intolerance all day. What I want to talk about today is that this trend of intolerance and illiberalism is now presenting a meaningful practical problem. Because any culture that seeks to exclude people who are a bit different will end up excluding a lot of the people who make a difference in the world. Or to put it another way, there's a utilitarian side to tolerance as well as an ideological side. We need a lot of the people who are being cancelled or who will cancel themselves in the face of the push. They're useful. They're not just valuable, they're useful. One of the strangest tendencies we have in the modern world, I think, is to fill important rooms with people who look different or who have different immutable characteristics, but who all have the same views on everything. And in fact, who were chosen because they have the same views on everything. And this is a mistake, but it's especially a mistake when it's applied to people whose job it is to think outside of the box. The story of the last decade, it seems increasingly clear, is a story of our removing unique people from positions of influence, asking the people who remain behind to refuse to speak up when they disagree, and building a system in which the best way to get ahead is to repeat whatever mantras might be popular that day. And this has reached such a weird climax that we now demand answers from people who've made it clear that they'd rather stay quiet and get on with whatever it is that they do. I don't know how many of you saw this, but there was this really strange campaign a few years ago to get Taylor Swift to start talking about politics, based on this idea that she had some responsibility to tell everyone where she stood. And it worked. Amazingly, it worked. She started talking about politics. So the same people who did this to her have now moved on to Dolly Parton, on whom it likely won't work. You don't mess with Dolly Parton. But I wondered then, as I wonder now, why? I mean, why did anyone care in the first place? Why should we put singers, of all people, in a pigeonhole? Why do we want to know which club they're in? Why are so many people nervous that they might be thinking the wrong things in private? Politics is not why we've heard of Taylor Swift or of Dolly Parton. It's not what they do. And also, if they were to give the wrong answers, then what? It really is extremely unlikely that all of the people who make a difference in our society are going to tick the boxes we establish for correct thinkers. And I don't think we should ask them. I recently read a book on the 1920s, which I talked about in my last event here, which was done over Zoom. When I read this book, I was left with the feeling that the eccentricity of many of the people that I discovered was not incidental to their success or their ingenuity, but in fact was its most likely cause. Or put another way, I felt many of the people in this book were trailblazers in their field, at least in part because they saw the world differently. It wasn't a bug, it was a feature. There's an old Apple advertisement that pays tribute to this. It's called "Here's to the Crazy Ones," which is fine. But the thing is, we can't pick and choose the craziness. If you try to bash in the rough edges of society's weirdos, you're probably going to lose their genius as well. The weird side of many people is also their good side. And John Stuart Mill once said that so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of the time. They are the visionaries who make giant imaginative leaps. Well, that word eccentric is from Latin. And literally, it means away from the center or away from what we think of as normal or ordinary. I prepared for this speech by reading about an awful lot of people who meet this description. Some of them had me crying with laughter. But over again, I found people who could quite easily have been shunned for being peculiar or flawed, and yeah, in some cases, flat out unpleasant, and whom I was extremely glad, nevertheless, had not been shunned because they were so indispensable. Alan Turing, the computer scientist who worked at Bletchley Park in England, played a vital role in deciphering German codes during the Second World War. He cracked the Enigma machine with his team. A man of whom Winston Churchill said had made the greatest, biggest contribution to winning the war, was told once that he had to go to London for a big meeting. So he got up from his chair and ran there, 40 miles away, ignoring the car that had been sent for him. He was one of many, many strange people who were nicknamed Churchill's wizards, who invented things such as bouncing bombs and fake inflatable tanks and tinfoil shards that stopped enemy radar. We don't need to know what those people thought about politics or religion. It doesn't matter. Nobody should care. And Pythagoras, the Greek mathematician, thought that fava beans, the edible fava beans, were to all intents and purposes human, and that eating them was tantamount to cannibalism. Nikola Tesla was afraid of circles. He wouldn't enter a building unless he'd walked around it 3 times first, and for some reason he had to polish his cutlery with exactly 18 napkins before he would eat anything. Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, had 2 obsessions in his life. One was inventing the telephone, and the other was teaching his dog to talk, which wasn't as successful. William Buckland, who wrote the first major book about dinosaurs and was perhaps the greatest geologist of the 19th century, refused to give scientific lectures unless he was on horseback, and managed to get himself appointed to a government committee on exotic animals just so he could import the creatures into Britain and eat them in his office. John Napier, who discovered logarithms and popularized the use of the decimal point in mathematics, always carried a spider when he traveled in a box and liked to use a rooster to tell him which of his servants was guilty of stealing from him. Henry Ford was a strange man with some pretty ugly views, frankly. So was Charles Lindbergh. But I don't know how different we expect to be. I mean, if you look around, how many of the biggest entrepreneurs do we think are completely normal? Elon Musk? I don't think so. Peter Thiel? Mark Zuckerberg? Is J.K. Rowling? You're not too far from here. There's an engineer called Alan Shilkey who, having been regarded as something of an extremist in his early career, is currently enjoying great success revolutionizing the American roller coaster industry. And Shilkey spends all of his time sitting in Idaho thinking how to throw the human body around steel track in unknown ways. Is he sane? Who cares? We need people who think odd things, as Shilkey does. My kids, 3 and 4, they're currently obsessed with Super Mario Odyssey on the Nintendo Switch, which I've played for hours and hours and hours now. And it occurred to me the other day while I was playing it just how completely weird the game is and how we sort of ignore that or even take it for granted. If you stop and think about it for a moment, Super Mario Odyssey is a game that features, for some reason, a pair of Italian plumbers who travel around the world in a flying hat, ducking in and out of green pipes to try to collect power moons that provide electricity to a place called New Donk City in order to save a princess from a monster who, for reasons we're never given, is trying to take over a mushroom kingdom. And I mean, what? What? And the guy who invented this was not an engineer. He had no formal training in computing whatsoever. He was an artist who liked the game Space Invaders in the late 1970s, decided that he probably wanted to make his own, didn't know how, managed to get a job at Nintendo as an apprentice in the planning department, and then annoyed everyone else who worked there until they agreed to code the game. And then he asked all sorts of difficult technical questions of them and baffled them a little bit by explaining that he had this idea, and this changed a bit in the final product, for a game. He said what the world really needed was not what they were doing, but was a game that featured a love triangle between a gorilla, a carpenter, and a girl. That was the first pitch for Mario. He eventually became a plumber, but he was supposed to be a carpenter. And the thing is, he was right. Mario is the best-selling video game in history, and it still makes kids happy nearly 40 years after it was released. Well, I'm 36, and Mario has been around my entire life. So it would be easy for me to assume that it just always was. that it's part of the world's furniture, like the trees or the oceans or Betty White. No. But there's a real risk in thinking like that, in assuming that the things that we enjoy just sort of are, when they're not. Weirdos made them. Weirdos who started with a blank slate and then had to fight everyone else to get them made. There's a popular theory at the moment about why autistic people seem to do so well in Silicon Valley. And this theory holds that it's because they are better than everyone else at avoiding groupthink. I think there's probably something to this, that in an age of conformity, the people who can't see the rules end up as the original thinkers. Now, as a culture, we often make a mistake when thinking about this. We say, well, why does it matter? You know, Elon Musk is rich and untouchable. What harm can come to him? But the risk here, of course, of intolerance and conformity is not to the people who have already made it. It's to the people who are yet to make it, but who are hounded out of society because they make one mistake, or they say something stupid, or they have the wrong opinions, or they don't know how to express themselves. Or, dare I say, because they didn't go to college or get the right credentials. If we go back to that word eccentric for a moment, and remember that it means away from the center or away from what we think of as ordinary, we should ask ourselves, do we really value people who do life differently? I think increasingly America has a bad tendency to look down on people who don't have college degrees, and worse, to presumptively shut them out of opportunities. Now, obviously, I am aware where I am today. I'm aware that I'm speaking to university students. I went to college myself. I enjoyed it. I'm not anti-college, I'm pro-college. But I do think it's important, nevertheless, that we make an effort to respect and listen to people who take different paths and avoid locking them out of our society at the first step. I said many times before, including here last time, that if aliens were to come down into our society, they might be forgiven for reporting back home that the primary issue facing America is that not enough Americans are going to college. We're obsessed with this topic in a way that I think misses why college is useful in the first place, which it is. To listen to politicians talk about college is to assume that it's automatically good if more people go, that going to college is the best or perhaps the only way of getting ahead in life, that our society is always improved by having more people with paper degrees, and that it's a major scandal that people who wish to educate themselves further are obliged to pay to do so. And bit by bit, it started in Britain, and it's much worse there, this has led to an insidious idea, which is that people who don't go to college have in some way failed, or that they have been failed. But they haven't. Now, it's true that a college degree can serve as proof of certain skills, such as critical thinking, a willingness to stick with things, a familiarity with institutions. But so does serving in the military. So does doing an apprenticeship as a plumber. So does taking a job at a charity. We've got to the point, though, at which most entry-level jobs now require a college degree. So what do we think is going to happen to the people who don't go, and as a result of this, don't gain the experience that has historically been the equivalent of getting a degree? And what happens once college is the sole means by which people come to learn what is expected of them? That is often how to behave according to the latest fashions. What's going to happen to the dropouts, to the people who come from nothing, to the people who aren't suited to it? Silicon Valley has become a peculiar place in that it's staffed now by a handful of extremely wealthy people who didn't follow the rules, who dropped out, never went, started in their garage. And then a massive army of people who did follow the rules. And yet, oddly enough, it's now the army that seems to be in charge. So I would counsel that we watch against this, that we try and avoid becoming a society in which the different and the weird and the eccentric are crowded out. America is an interesting, rich, and successful place, and I'm so proud to have moved here and then to have become a citizen. But it is not so interesting, rich, and successful that it can afford to stop innovating or to discourage the people who make a difference. And it's not so interesting, rich, and successful that it can forget why it became interesting, rich, and successful in the first instance. Individualism, tolerance, fragmented government, freedom of conscience, all of these ideas have culminated in a place that I, all those in this room, inherited. And we did inherit it, especially me, as an immigrant. I did nothing to create this country. If we decide that those ideas are old-fashioned, if we decide that we now have all the answers and that we can merely manage our way through the future without the need for dissenters or people who make mistakes or people who make us uncomfortable, we will decline. If we stop shrugging our shoulders and saying, it takes all sorts, we'll decline. If we give in to tribalism, we will decline. In my view, our biggest challenge in the coming years is to understand when and where it is appropriate to demand that our weirdos fit in, and to ensure that our system allows them to do so. You probably don't want your dentist or the guy at the DMV or your pilot to be a weirdo. But actors, entrepreneurs, writers, academics, scientists, journalists even, definitely. And my hope is that we don't forget that. Thank you very much.
Awesome, let's have a seat. Okay, thank you so much, Charles. Welcome back to SUU.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're going to do something really cool today. First of all, it's great to see everyone in attendance. Yay. Welcome to everyone who's watching online. I think we're going to get a mic set up. And for those of you who know A.P.E.X events know that we don't often do an audience Q&A. So this is your chance to really take advantage of that opportunity. I'm going to get the conversation going a little bit with Charles, but if you have a question and would like to ask it, Tony's bringing a mic here to the middle of the room, so please feel free to come on up, and when I see you, I'll stop talking and get your question in. So Charles, I wanted to start by saying I love this topic, and I'm looking at it a bit from the academic lens, which is very invigorating, because I strongly and wholeheartedly agree with the idea of the weirdo in the academic setting and what great interest that brings to the environment. I was curious, you know, one of the things I wanted to ask is, what do you say to leaders, not necessarily of an institution like ours, but just in general? What do you say as words of advice to encourage the weirdos? How do we keep that alive?
Well, as I say, I think it's an increasingly tough time for people who see the world differently, not least because we have become increasingly uncharitable in how we treat people who make mistakes.
Yeah.
This person I'm about to mention is not a weirdo particularly, but the quarterback, Kyler Murray, was the Heisman winner a couple of years ago. And on the day that he got the Heisman Trophy, journalists went through tweets that he had posted when I think he was 15 years old.
Oh my gosh.
And it was all over the newspapers. And so he spent the day, which is probably, I don't know him, but it's probably the crowning moment up to that point of his life. I mean, just think about how much work went into getting where he did. Answering questions about why he had said this or that. Now, that didn't cancel Kyler Murray. He went on to be drafted, and he will do very well. I would like to know, though, what those journalists thought they were doing and what they thought they were achieving.
Yeah.
It didn't serve any public interest. I certainly, thankfully, I didn't have a Twitter account when I was 15 because it didn't exist, but I'm very glad that nobody can look through my 15 or 16-year-old behavior or arguments. So I think we have two choices. Either, and this is increasingly what parents now tell me that they tell their kids, we say, don't leave any paper trail. That's one option. It's probably good advice, but it's also terrible advice if you want people to make mistakes, if you want people to try out ideas. I mean, if you're essentially saying to young people, if you make one mistake, that will be it, then you're going to have a very different world. One thing America has always had going for it over Britain is that we've been much better at elevating people and respecting people who have failed. In fact, people who have failed are often seen as having a wisdom that is welcome. There was a law until, I think, about 2005 in Britain that if you had been on the board of a company that had gone bankrupt, you couldn't be on the board of another company for 5 years. Why?
Yeah.
Those are exactly the people that you want. Not only those people, but of course you want people on your board who saw it happen from the inside, who understood the mistakes that were made. And you especially want people who lost their own money in their own business because they felt it more keenly. Now that law was repealed, and I think it's made Britain a better place for business and innovation. But if we replace that with a culture that says, don't ever screw up,
Right.
don't ever try and fail, then we've essentially done the same thing by another means. So I suppose what I'm saying is, what I would not say to those people is to follow that advice. And the second thing that I would say, and I understand this is very difficult, especially for people who have no power. It's much easier to give this advice to Elon Musk or to J.K. Rowling because, I mean, they could go live on a desert island tomorrow. Nobody can really do much to them. But I do think people have to start standing up more than they do and saying, no, we don't want to live in a culture in which people who are a bit different are marginalized or people who make mistakes are punished forever. Because once they do that, I think the culture will start to change.
But that's the challenge, right? The fear of it. I mean, I think of yourself as a writer. You have the tools of your words and of your speeches and your talks, and there's a bit of a maybe not a protection there, but if I compare it to even my own life, there's so much fear to do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing
right.
or go against the grain, because you ultimately want to protect your position and everything like that. So I wonder, what do you say about the fear?
Well, so I do have a slight advantage. You're absolutely right in that I'm paid to write. Now, I mean, if I came out tomorrow and went stark raving mad, it wouldn't hold forever.
Of course.
But I do, of course, have some protection in the way some tenured professors would have protection for that reason. That doesn't, though, mean the problem goes away. And it's something that I've noticed in the last 10 years since I started doing this is I write more defensively than I did 5 or 6 years ago because I don't want people to misinterpret what I've said. So I make sure that it won't happen. It's almost insurance against an outrage mob. And I've spoken to so many other writers who say they do this too. And that actually makes us all dumber. It's a waste of time.
Right.
It leads to a breakdown in trust. If you're constantly writing, worrying that someone is going to say, I think you mean this, and then gin up a mob, then you're actually being a less effective journalist or communicator or whatever it is that you are. So there is a little bit of protection there, but it doesn't obviate that. But as I say, I think this will be solved when a critical mass of people start saying no. And I'm afraid at the moment they don't. At the moment they issue these groveling apologies. I understand why they do it, but it's about time that instead of crying on the floor because someone found something you wrote when you were 15, you say, don't be so ridiculous. Yeah, I don't think that anymore, but this has got nothing to do with today. Go and do something productive. I do think it's starting to happen. It's just not there yet. And that's why I say this is one of the big challenges facing us, and I think it's something we have to fix, because if it gets really bad, we will dry up as a nation. I'm
curious. Oh, great. We have a question. I'll hold my question. Please, go ahead.
Sorry. So in your examples, you brought up the star that was fired from The Mandalorian. I know in her specific case, she was fired because she related the criticism that a lot of Republicans were receiving was, she related it to Jews and the Holocaust, and saying they were receiving the same type of discrimination, specifically posting a picture of a Nazi hunting down a Jew at that time. She also had posted comments about the election being fraudulent, Trump support, all the jazz that happened with Trump supporters. So my question is basically, with this thought of protecting the weirdos, are you also, is your thought also the culture that Trump fostered? I would call it a mob culture, but everybody joining in under Trump, trying to be divergent of what they thought was currently happening. A lot with liberalism, just saying we're Republican, we need to change politics and everything. I'm just curious to know your thoughts on that. Where was the culture that Trump was fostering in your mind a good thing or a bad thing? And with the star of The Mandalorian being fired, do you feel like that was one case where maybe it was okay for a company to fire someone that they thought didn't align with their views, or do you feel like that was too far from the...
Well, the first thing I would say is I don't think it's a rule that we should care what people like Gina Carano think. And if you go back to the 1950s, this was a great project of American liberalism, not conservatism, was the notion that if you were an actor or a screenwriter, that you should not have your politics held against you. In 1950, the threat from the Soviet Union was extraordinarily real. My father grew up in the Air Force, and in 1963, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was told by the manager of the base they lived on that they would probably be one of the first targets and that they might want to think about saying goodbye to each other. Now, thankfully, that didn't happen. But communism was not some abstract threat. It was a real conflict. And yet the position, and I think the correct position of American liberalism, was that we should not have been firing people from their jobs for their private political views. That the hero of the pushback on the American left in the 1950s was a man named Dalton Trumbo. Dalton Trumbo was not just a communist. Dalton Trumbo really admired and liked Joseph Stalin, who murdered millions of people. And I don't think Dalton Trumbo should have been fired from his job as a screenwriter. I just don't think that's a healthy cultural... I don't like him. I don't like what he thought. But I don't think that's a healthy cultural habit. So the first thing I would say is, irrespective of what Gina Carano said, I'm not sure why we have gone down this road. But on the specifics, I also don't think that it made any sense. I mean, Gina Carano believes a lot of things that I don't. She believes that the election was stolen. It wasn't. She believes that the vaccine is dangerous and that coronavirus is a hoax. It's not. But what she said was really not particularly different than what anyone else has said. And if you look at what she actually wrote, her crime, insofar as it was one, was extrapolating much too far out to the point it became an offensive comparison. And she said, well, people who believe what she believes will be persecuted, and that's a bit like the Holocaust, right? Well, it's not. It's not like the Holocaust. It's bad, but it's not like the Holocaust. So I don't think what she said was smart. But her co-star in The Mandalorian compared the border policy of the Trump administration in 2018 to the Holocaust, which is the same mistake. You look at the pictures from the border, you look at kids being held in facilities. He actually posted a photograph from a Palestinian birthday party. I suppose all brown kids look the same to some people. It wasn't of kids on the border. But there are a lot of really good criticisms of what the Trump administration did on the border. But just like Gina Carano's criticisms, they're not like the Holocaust. The immigration services in the United States are not Nazis, and they were not herding 6-7 million people into gas chambers. He's still working there. So, I mean, I don't think we should be playing this game at all, but I also think one of the other risks with it is that you end up playing favorites. You end up making the rules up as you go along in a way that disproportionately affects one person or another. Now, in the 1950s, that was disproportionately aimed at people on the left. There were no people on the right who got caught up in the Red Scare, and now it seems to be the other way around. And that, of course, is another reason why you probably shouldn't do it in the first place, when it has nothing whatsoever to do with Gina Carano's job or Dalton Trumbo's job. If she were running for president, of course that would matter a great deal. She wasn't. She's an actress in a televised soap opera about space. And we need to remember the context here.
That actually dovetails right back to the question I was going to ask, which is, I wonder how much of this is an issue of discourse or understanding reasonable discourse. Context maybe is another way to say it. But that's what I was going to ask, was that on the one hand, you know, we want to be able to say things and to allow the weirdos to be. But on the other hand, especially in our social media culture, everyone has an opinion. Mm-hmm. And so perhaps I wonder how much of it is moving forward is getting a bit more discerning. I don't even know if that's the right word, but just kind of going, okay, that's a ridiculous statement. Right. We're just not going to, you know. How do we maybe move forward as a culture to that so that we can make those distinctions a little better?
Well, I mean, the first thing we have to do is abandon the idea that speech makes people unsafe, absent extraordinary circumstances. So the American Constitution is one of the most radical, in a good sense, documents that has ever been written, and probably the most radical document that is still undergirding a government in the world. The Supreme Court, and this is on a bipartisan basis, most Supreme Court free speech cases go 8-1 or 9-0, has determined that the only point at which speech can be prosecuted by the government is if it is likely to lead to imminent lawless behavior. In other words, if it is likely to incite criminal activity. That is very, very narrow. People say free speech is not unlimited. That's true, but it may as well be. If you look at the provisions within the decisions that guide this, you can say, I can sit here on this stage right now and say, I think we should have a revolution in the United States. And there's nothing the government can do about it. What I can't say is, I think we should have a revolution. Let's do it in 2 hours. Meet me with your guns outside in the parking lot. At that point, it becomes brigaded to action. But anything short of that is tolerable legally. And I think that we should adopt the same rule culturally. Unfortunately, we've got a little bit far down the road of pretending that speech we don't like, even if it's very upsetting, even if I hate it or think it's offensive or idiotic, makes us unsafe. And in almost every case, it really does not. So, as I suggested in my talk, we seem to have forgotten how to shrug and say, okay, that person, you don't even have to say, well, it's just their opinion. It's fine to shrug and say, I hate that person, I think they're a bad influence, I want nothing to do with them. But this endless desire to sort of push people to the margins. And just before I finish this, I want to make clear here, I'm not only talking about cancel culture. That's not it's part of it. It's part of the same process. But I'm not saying in order to save the country, we have to ignore anything offensive that is said. What I am suggesting is that the same intellectual movements and currents that have led to our current moment have also led to a locking down of speech, conscience rights, to the rise of human resources departments in corporations that will tolerate nothing other than absolute fealty to a really mundane milquetoast company line. And that's when you start losing out, not on the Gina Caranos of the world, but that's when you start losing out on the Steve Jobses of the world. I mean, this is perhaps a good example. Steve Jobs was kind of, a dick. I mean, excuse my language, but he was. I mean, he was rude. I mean, in his private life, he was terrible. But he shouted at people. He fired people summarily in elevators. He had absolutely no time for his staff unless they did precisely what he wanted. But I'm glad, that notwithstanding, that he wasn't sort of cancelled or straitjacketed by a corporate culture that led to him being pushed to the margins.
Thank you. Yes?
So I have a lot of friends that I've met here at college that have different beliefs or different viewpoints than what I have. And sometimes they can get really fired up about those beliefs and kind of start to cancel other people who don't see the same as them. And I see it kind of as a third party. How can I have a conversation with that friend and kind of help them be aware of how it looks from my angle without becoming one of those self-appointed arbiters myself?
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with arguing strongly back. I don't think that what you've just described would be even close to cancelling someone.
Okay.
Cancelling someone or pushing them aside is when you're saying you can't have that opinion, or I'm not talking to you, or worse, I'm going to the dean's office and I'm going to use the authority there against you. We should have strong arguments. I mean, not only is that what the United States is supposed to protect, that's what a university is for. And this is actually one of the weirdest developments of the last decade. If you looked around the country and you tried to rank institutions that should foster debate to a almost extreme level, you would, in theory, put universities and newspapers at the top and say corporations lower down, churches below that, and families right at the bottom. Because, families are not democracies. Maybe when everyone is older, they are. But, I don't have long debates with my 4-year-old over whether he's going to bed on the grounds that his free speech needs to be respected. But a university is supposed to be a place where people have exactly those arguments. So is a newspaper. And in some senses, we've sort of reversed this now, where people seem to feel the most alarmed about having the conversations you're describing on university campuses, where the New York Times gets in uproar because somebody writes an op-ed that they don't like. I mean, again, that's another area where the application of the rules is inconsistent. So I don't know how many people followed this, but Tom Cotton, his senator from Arkansas, argued during the riots last summer that the federal government should send in the National Guard. Now, I personally was not in favor of this, but this is a position held by 55% of Americans at the time. He wrote this op-ed. It was kind of anodyne and straightforward, and they eventually apologized for it. People were crying at their desks and saying they'd been threatened by this. And the editor who commissioned it, plus the submissions editor, were fired. Mm-hmm. Now, if the New York Times had that rule consistently, I would think it was a fairly useless newspaper, or at least should abolish its op-ed page. But about 2 weeks later, they published a piece by a representative from the Chinese Communist Party explaining why the protesters in Hong Kong had to be suppressed. And a year later, they'd passed an op-ed by Al-Qaeda, quite literally by Al-Qaeda. And 2 years before that, they had published an op-ed by Vladimir Putin. Now, pick one. Pick one. So, we need to always look at this in the context of what we're trying to achieve. And there is absolutely no reason. I don't know your politics or which side you're on.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't.
But there's absolutely no reason why on a college campus anyone should feel like that. You can't have completely unfettered debate at work. You can't have completely unfettered debate on an aeroplane. But you can in a college campus, and you can at a newspaper. And I'm a little bit worried that we're sort of forgetting why this room exists, why this campus exists. I, of course, don't mean specifically this university in general. And that as a result of it, we're damaging some of the habits that we've formed that as a country have made us what we are.
Cool. Thank you.
How do we advocate for it, though? I mean, I want to be part of the solution. I want to be part of making it better. I want to be part of helping students like that foster better conversations. I want to be part of better conversations like that myself. I mean, to be honest, I've been in situations where I don't want to say anything because, you're a visible person on campus. You don't want to, how do we collectively make that shift, just even from the people in this room, perhaps?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. And actually, it is up to you in many ways. Because look, we had dinner last night, and one of the questions I was asked was, well, where do you think the average college student is on this stuff? And the answer is, they're fine. It actually is the case that most people are quite happy to have conversations. It's just there's a small number of people who manage to co-opt the faculty and institute these rules at the expense of everyone else. That's what happens time and time again. So, I mean, it is actually in many ways up to you. And this isn't everywhere. I mean, the University of Chicago, for example, has adopted a very solid and admirable free speech code that is now university policy. And if you're put on the spot in that scenario at the University of Chicago, they say, I'm sorry, but this is a university and these are our rules. Now, of course, that does not mean that if somebody puts on a Klan hat and starts harassing minority students, that nothing can be done about it. But it does mean that the normal conversations that we all have in life are deemed presumptively to be acceptable. So where those rules don't exist, I think you're going to have to agitate for them.
I'm getting my strength up. Well, thank you for that advice. Looks like we have another question. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I had to write it down because I blanked, right? Anyway, so as individuals and wannabe entrepreneurs entering the business world, how do you recommend us battling either the cancel culture or the way things are and people having different views from us and us still wanting to fight for what we believe in and still becoming successful in what we are endeavoring on?
Well, I think the first thing is you should set up your institutions for yourself as far as is possible and adopt a very broad and tolerant way of working. We can complain all day about the way things might be run at Twitter or Facebook. So, don't go work there and don't adopt those policies. Those companies won't always be there. I think the average life expectancy of a company now is something like 18 years. It used to be 100. My colleague Kevin Williamson always points this out, that U.S. Steel on Wall Street was called the company. They really believed that they were U.S. Steel. They were the steel company in the United States. Now, I think I'm right in saying it's the 27th largest steel producer in the world. Things change more than they did. But it's really important that people who don't want to emulate those institutions, what used to be called the man, set up their own systems. And actually, this is a good example maybe. Gina Carano, who was fired from The Mandalorian, is now working for an independent movie production company. And one of that production company's rules is that we just don't care what your politics are. Now again, if Gina Carano starts berating people on the set, it behaves hugely unprofessionally, discriminates against people at work, that would be a huge issue. But a group of people have got together, they've raised some money, and they say, we don't like the way that it works at Disney or 20th Century Fox. We're going to create our own companies. I don't think we're going to fix this by taking over large existing institutions from within. I think we're going to fix it by you, literally you, leaving here when you're done and saying, okay, how do I want the world to look? And how would I want to be treated if I were working somewhere else, and then treat the people you're working with and your employees like that?
Great, thank you. Well, we have time for one more question, and I always like to kind of ask sort of what you're reading, or if there's something that you think, you know, apart from your book, of course, which everybody should be reading, but if there's anything that you think, if you could make required reading on all college campuses, what would that be?
Well, I mean, for politics students, I would say the Federalist Papers, because one of the best ways to navigate the United States is to understand how and why it was set up. There are many flaws in the way it was set up, but you have to understand them to grasp that. And it seems to me that the Federalist Papers is under-examined. Mm-hmm. It's there on the internet for free. It is a guidebook. It's an instruction manual for the United States, and a good one. So if we're talking politics, which is what I studied with history, I would say that. But otherwise, read broadly. I like courses that teach the classics. I did them myself. But one of the best ways probably of getting through life is to read about all sorts of topics and teach yourself. You know, this will sound like a really silly small example, but our dishwasher broke. And I didn't want to pay someone to fix it when I thought I probably would be able to do that myself. You can, on YouTube, become a dishwasher engineer, basically. I mean, that every model, there is a video somewhere that shows you, step by step, how to fix your dishwasher. You might need to buy a couple of tools, a particular sort of screwdriver, but it's doable. That wasn't true 50 years ago. My car key, if the dealership replaces the battery, they want $100. It's a $2 battery from Amazon. And there's a very particular way of opening it. And again, it's available on YouTube. Now, these are very small examples, although they're important and practical examples. And it fits in a little bit with my point about universities, because often people say, oh, what, are you a dishwasher engineer? No, I just have an internet connection. But that now is true across a whole range of topics. The best thing a college can do for you is teach you how to think, not what, how to think. Now, if you're doing a vocational course, there's a lot of what that is important. Doctors need to know what to think in many cases. But how to think is the first bit, and then you just have to go and do it. And we have never been more blessed with the amount of information that we have available. If you go back to the American founding, you find a lot of people who were lawyers and doctors and architects. And the temptation is to say, goodness me, they must have been really intelligent. Well, of course, many of them were really intelligent, but there also wasn't that much to know about medicine or architecture compared to now. You know, I've been reading a book by Ron Chernow, the biography of George Washington. His daughter had epileptic fits. And the doctor that they hired made it much worse because he prescribed the same thing that they always prescribed, which was bleeding.
Right.
They bled her, and of course she got weaker, and so the fits got worse. Doctors now have an enormous amount more to learn. But that information is out there. And there's no need for permission to find it, and most of it, thankfully, is free. So, you know, all the way from fixing your dishwasher up to all of the works that are referenced in these banners here are out there, and there's really no longer any excuse for not taking advantage of it.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. Learn how to think and then just go do it.
Right.
Well, I love that. Well, thank you so much for the time. We will be on the radio today at 3 on KSUU Thunder 91.1, and then the civility event at 5:45 in Business 120. Yeah, in 120. But this has just been such a really robust conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for your knowledge and expertise.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.